Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for attending this conference. It's actually a great new way to be diving together, although virtually. Let me introduce myself. I am Alessandro Marroni. I am the founder and president of the Dan Europe Foundation. And I'm going to talk to you about something that is of interest for all of us divers, what I call the economy of decompression. Let me share the screen so that you will be seeing the presentation and hopefully follow the concepts that I'm going to explain. Okay. So we are going to talk about how we can maximize our safety of decompression. First of all, we have to understand what we are dealing with. We are dealing with the mechanisms of bubble formation in our body. Essentially, we're dealing with two mechanisms. One that has to do with the dissolved gas, and the other one that has to do with expanding volumes of gas and essentially the cause of the pulmonary barotrauma, that is the rupture of the lung due to excessive expansion of gas. We have what I call the diver's laws. We must respect them. But what are these diver's laws? Essentially, the two laws that rule our body when exposed to increasing or decreasing, or let's say varying pressure. The Boyle-Mariotte law that rules the change of volume of gas when exposed to increasing pressure, where it's diminishes, and the decrease in pressure where the volume increases. And the other one, which I depicted here with a bottle of Coca-Cola, is the so-called Henry's laws. That rules the way we absorb gas, inner gas, in our tissues, and the way we dispose of that after the end of our hyperbaric exposure. How does that happen? It happens with air entering our body through our lungs, passing from the lungs to the arterial blood, and this is the so-called on-gassing process, and reaching the tissues. This is when pressure increases. When pressure decreases, the gas that reached the tissues actually leaves them through the venous blood and again through the lungs and out in the expired, exhaled air. And this is the process of off-gassing. This is what rules our compression and decompression safety, actually. Once we reach that stage, so we are starting the off-gassing, we can incur into a situation which is called supersaturation. What is supersaturation? We are saturated when the tissue pressure of gas is equal to the ambient pressure. But when the ambient pressure starts to decrease on ascent, we are leaving the bottom with an amount of gas in excess of the ambient pressure. This is supersaturation. In other words, our tissues are more saturated, have more pressure than the environment pressure. This is what we call supersaturation. Actually, this is the reason why we have a driving force pushing the excess gas out of the tissues and where it belongs, back into the atmosphere. But there is a limit that we can tolerate. And this is what we call critical supersaturation. If the supersaturation exceeds a certain value, which is what we used to call the M value, where M stands for maximum value, that is a point that the tissues are not tolerating anymore, and this is where and when bubbles can start to form into the tissues, any tissue, but mainly the blood. This is what we call the critical supersaturation. Based on these concepts, mathematical models were developed so to predict what can happen and to regulate it by algorithms, by procedures that through mathematical calculation resemble or mimic what is actually happening in our physiology, in our body. There are many ways by which divers try to manipulate these concepts, and this is what we know as conservatism. What does that mean? Essentially, the way to make your dive less aggressive. The conservatism methods are very frequently empirical and personalized. They are not based on other than concepts or ideas or beliefs. Some are more logic. They use some mathematical approach. They use numerical scale. They use reduction of percentages of supersaturation. But by and large, most of these are actually not sufficiently described. They're treated as proprietary data many times. We have essentially two leading models to calculate our decompression, the so-called compartment model and the bubble model. The bubble model deals with growth and expansion of bubbles as such. The compartment models deal with the amount of supersaturation that is achieved by diving. Since, as you can see from this graph, the use of the two models is virtually the same, with a very small percentage of divers that still use stables, we opted to study the compartment model, and the data that I'm going to present to you refer to the compartment model. It is noteworthy to observe that these numbers that you're seeing here are related to 320 cases of decompression illness that occurred during 2017. And as you can see, there was no difference in the kind of model that that these cases refer to. When dealing with compartment models, a very interesting approach is to use the concept that Eric Baker developed, and that is the concept of the gradient factor. What is the gradient factor? It allows to express a certain limit as a fraction of another limit. We said that we are dealing with supersaturation, and that means that it exceeds a maximum value that is tolerable by the tissue. So the gradient factor is nothing else than a percentage of this maximum value that we have as the threshold that we should not go over. This concept is normally used with Haldanian methods, which are the ones that I defined as compartment methods before. We have two sets of gradient factors, the so-called gradient factor law, that is the value of the M, the percent of the M value of the pilot compartment. What is a pilot compartment? Is the compartment that is more loaded at that time, and this gradient factor low determines the depth of the first stop at depth. And then we have a gradient factor high, that is the percent of the M value of the pilot compartment. Again, pilot is the compartment which is more loaded at a given time, and that regulates the time when we can actually leave the water and surface. To show it graphically, if you look at this is a simulated dive. We have three tissues, a fast, a slow, and a medium one. This is the ambient pressure. This is our level of supersaturation. We ascend until the tissue reach a critical level of supersaturation, the M level, the maximum level tolerable. So here we stop and we let it drain its excess gas. The other one is less saturated, so it still saturates while we desaturate the first one. So at this stage, when desaturation has been sufficient, we keep ascending. And as you can see at this stage, the other tissue, the medium time hemisaturation time tissue, becomes the leading one. So this was the pilot tissue in the first phase, and this becomes the pilot tissue in the middle phase of decompression, whereas the very slow ones are still uploading and are not critical in any way critical at this stage. Then we decide to ascend, and we surface here at sea level F, and we surface with levels of supersaturation in our tissues which are below the maximum allowed value. So this is an apparently safe dive according to the tables and the mathematical models that we're using. So we are dealing with undersaturated tissue, with supersaturated tissue, and with excess, with critical supersaturation. That means the accident area. Mark Powell defined this in a very interesting way. So you have the M value line, you have the ambient pressure, you decompress, then you stop when you reach the maximum value allowed, and you go up, staying below the M value line in this gray zone. And Mark defined this in a very funny way, bend and mend. So you produce bubbles, then you reduce them until you eventually surface. So we are dealing actually with a fuzzy gray area where we have the M value. Under that, we can have bubbles, but they're normally not dangerous. Very low, if you keep very much below the M value, we will not have bubbles. If you go above the M value, we will have critical supersaturation, and we may incur in what we call symptomatic bubbles. So bubbles that generate problems. Of course, the more we approach the M value, the less we will need to decompress. The more we are far from the M value, the more we will need to decompress, the more time in decompression we will have to spend. But on the contrary, if we have less deco, we will have more risk. If we have more deco, we will have less risk. So this is the stage where we have to play our dive, trying to get the best out of what I call the economy of decompression, by limiting as much as possible the chance, the opportunity, the possibility to develop symptoms, and playing around, finding the best way and the best level of managing our supersaturation. So if, for example, we keep our actual profile at this level, we will have a decent risk, a risk that we can accept. If we are closer to the M value, the risk of our dive will be higher. So we are playing in this safety area, and this is our safety margin. In order to understand better what I am trying to explain now, we analyzed 40,000 dives recently, but we started from this relatively old paper of 2004, where we applied the concept of reducing the supersaturation to well below the maximum allowed value. And we saw that by reducing this supersaturation, we incurred into deeper stops, but applying this concept, we greatly reduced the number of bubbles. HBG stays for high bubble grades after the dive, as opposed to a dive where the M value was reached without any limitation. So in 2014, we concluded that deep stops were good. But then the US Navy started a study again and exposed the volunteer divers, military divers, to a relatively aggressive profile, comparing no deep stop versus deep stop dives, and they found out that deep stops produced actually a lot more bubbles and even a lot more DCS cases than the shallow stops. They had 3 DCS cases in their shallow stop sample and 10 DCS cases in their deep stop samples. Therefore, they concluded that deep stops are bad. So where is the truth? And why did the US Navy study fail in showing that the deep stops were good? Probably they exaggerated in the deep stops by this way supersaturating the very slow tissues. Actually, this is what they did. So it was intermediate depth deep stops. At depth, the deep stops were very short, but here, this purple area, you will see that this kind of deep stops actually added gas loading in the slower gas compartments. They applied a modality, a conservatism, which can be assimilated to a VPM +7 conservatism, which is actually something that virtually no technical diver uses. No technical diver exceeds in this excess of conservatism, because we all think that this may load the slow compartments and then we pay the bill at the end of the dive. So the real conclusion is that deep stops are neither bad nor good, but they are complicated and they need to be understood in order for divers to know what they're actually doing. Actually, deep stop is a misleading term because you can actually stop too deep, stop not enough deep, stop for too long, or for not enough time. And you may actually overdo it. So we should be ready not to throw away the baby with the bathwater and not to say simply they are either good or bad. they have to be understood. And all the answers are not known. And this is why we try to understand better the developments of Deco theory. And you cannot talk about Deco theories if you don't consider the bubbles. We have bubbles whenever we ascend. This video shows bubbles that are produced from a not aggressive dive, 25 meters for 25 minutes. We call them asymptomatic bubbles. They do not produce significant problems. On the other end, if the bubbles are too many, if they come out of a critical supersaturation, they can produce symptoms that are either mechanical in nature, they are biochemical in nature, because the bubbles are not as inert as they may be considered. They interact with blood components, with cells of our blood, of our tissues, and they produce inflammation. They are considered as foreign bodies by our organism, and they are fought against. But sometimes we are suffering from friendly fire, because the aggression against these foreign bodies actually is detrimental to the body itself by an excess of inflammation. And this can in turn lead to tissue damage. The other surprise that we saw analyzing all of our database is that the vast majority of the decompression cases, illness cases that we treated, had actually respected the rules, and so they could have been considered undeserved, because the divers did not remember having made any error, any mistake. They remembered having respected the rules of decompression. So are we dealing with an extreme luck, like this poor snail escaping a dreadful fate? Or are we dealing with extreme misfortune, like this other diver? In order to try and understand that, we analyzed now almost 70,000 dives. The paper that I'm showing you, and that is freely downloadable because it's free access, is the analysis of 40,000 dives. All of them were recorded by electronic dive profiles, questionnaire for the status of health of divers, and many of them were also monitored with the Doppler monitor for bubbles. And we also had the opportunity to study 327 decompression illness cases out of this number, and compare what was the difference between the uneventful dives and the eventful dives. We found that, as average, the diving community dives conservatively. Even if we had depths of 105 meters in this sample, the average depth was 27 meters, and the average gradient factor high was 66% of the maximum allowed, and without serious mistakes regarding speed of ascent or other. Therefore, we can assume that divers tend to dive very conservatively, and this is probably one of the main reasons why we don't have so many accidents. We found significant differences and correlations between bubbles and depth, which is not a surprise. The deeper you dive, the more risky the dive is, and the higher supersaturation you achieve, so the higher gradient factor you achieve, the higher chance you have to produce bubbles from zero bubbles to high bubble grade here. A lesson to be learned is that bubbles do not develop immediately, but they tend to develop in time. This is what we call the bubble wave. And actually, the major production or presence of bubbles in our bloodstream is not on ascent, but actually between 30 and 45 minutes after the ascent. And we have a take-home message here, because this is the reason why we recommend not to make any significant effort after the dive, because this can mobilize bubbles even more. There is a correlation, a significant correlation between proneness to produce bubbles and age, and proneness to produce bubble and fat mass, which means that keeping fit is important. Keeping fit in good condition, and keeping fit can also diminish your biological age independently of your chronological age. The same correlations could be seen not only in bubble production, but also in susceptibility to decompression illness, both with age and fat mass. So we kept on studying this, and we tried to understand a way to guide divers to keep within safety margins as much as possible. But while analyzing the sample, we also realized this very surprising data, and that is that the vast majority of the uneventful dives were in the region of 70% of the maximum allowed value, which is not a surprise. But the surprise was that the vast majority, over 50% of the eventful dive, the dives that ended with decompression illness, were in areas of supersaturation, which were in the region of 80% of the maximum value. If you look at the end of this, of the blue blocks plot here, you will see that only a minor percentage of these dives dove beyond the M value, the 100%, the maximum allowed value. All the others were well below. And the median, the vast majority, was in the region of 80% of the M value. This is a surprise, because actually this area, this level of supersaturation, 80%, is considered as perfectly tolerable by the current algorithms and the current diving guidelines we have. Actually, we could also see that by reducing the gradient factor, by reducing the critical supersaturation accordingly, and staying within the 70% value, we had an extreme reduction of bubbles, as could be seen, not only heard, but seen with echocardiography, and this is a sample of the echocardiography we used. If we plot the bubble grade from 0 bubbles to very high grade bubbles here, we will see that the curve goes steep up when we go over 80% of the maximum allowed value. Again, if you are over 80%, and especially if you're over 85%, you have a very consistent possibility to develop a lot of bubbles. And having lots of bubbles means having more probability of decompression illness. As you can see, bubble grades are related to higher probability of having 80% probability in this case, 16 to 74% probability in this statistics of developing decompression illness when having all these bubbles circulating in your organism. This actually confirmed what we had already seen by observing that 60% of the decompression illness cases that we observed in our database were undeserved. We are dealing with current algorithms that actually have an evident gray area, gray zone in their mathematical ability to predict DCS. So the conclusion is obvious. We have to reduce the amount of bubbles, because less venous gas emboli, less venous bubbles, less bubbles in our body means less risk of decompression sickness. And we also must understand that bubbles are not as innocent as they may be considered, because bubbles are also the cause of interactions with our body system and cells. And so even if they are not so many, they can produce problems that we have to diminish. So how can we improve Deco safety? We have to reduce our bubble low, and we have to limit their effects as much as possible. And we have to reduce our own risk factors by improving fitness and keeping well hydrated. There is a very strong correlation between hydration and the possibility to develop decompression illness. Can we go further? Of course, yes. We can provide real-time information to the diver about the risk, the critical supersaturation risk they're running. And we do that by our newly developed Diver Safety Guardian, which as soon as you emerge, as you surface, can provide you with a decompression risk analysis in real time connected to our server. So you can simply connect your dive computer to our system. Our system is compatible with virtually all the dive computers now on the market, and immediately have a feedback about the risk of your dive expressed in normal, moderate, smiley ways. So you will have a red face for high risk, a yellow face for medium risk, a green face for low risk, but you will also have the data of the achieved supersaturation and the entire profile of your dive, which is a great thing to know and also a great tool for instructors. Not only that, but the system will also allow to geolocate the diver together with the recompression risk analysis, which helps in case of the need of search and rescue, because the geolocation will also provide by the beacon modality information on the area, on the meteorological conditions of the area, and so on. And this is vital for search and rescue missions. And now what we are trying to do is not only to have this after the dive, after you exit the water, but actually to achieve the possibility to provide divers with feedback information immediately in real time while the diver is actually under the water, providing the diver with Deco risk analysis, news about his physiology, and also spotting in terms of geolocation where the diver is. This is a screenshot of my mobile phone. Last year we were in the Maldives in 2019, and this is what I was receiving in Italy from the Maldives, from a team of 5 divers who were diving. This is in Italian, but it says that the Dan Europe research team is diving at the depth of 20 meters. Then I had another message, an SMS from underwater. And the diving team was diving at 10 meters and then at 5 meters. And then I asked them, are you active here, attivo? And they answered. They saw this in their prototype screen on the system they were carrying with them. And immediately I also received an image of their geolocation with GPS coordinates here. And this, to my knowledge, is the first SMS exchange from an underwater team. In case they are not okay, but they have a problem, they could press an SOS button, and by clicking on the link that was shown in my mobile phone, they would receive a message that I could transmit to them, and I would receive their geolocation, which again is something that is relatively unprecedented and very important. Now we are going even further. because we are providing diver with intelligent wearables that will be able to monitor not only their geolocation and the other data about Deco analysis, which is derived from their dive computer, but also data from their physiology. This is an electrocardiogram recorded underwater. And this is the goal. We are now developing a prototype that will allow the diver to be connected in real time with bidirectional modality of communication, not only with the dive boat, but also through the GSM or the satellite network with an alarm center that will be able to understand, to provide data, to provide the diver with Deco stress analysis, to also geolocate the divers, and to be in the condition to immediately spot where the diver is, what the diver problem is, and so on. This is our way to further mitigate diving risk and to assist divers as much as we can. And all this is now in the prototype phase. It's being industrialized and will be available on our DAN app during the course of 2021. Thank you for your attention. I couldn't see the chat screen in case there are questions. So probably I will try now to. Okay, here. I don't see questions. So I thank you, everybody, for your attention. And if you have any question, please do not hesitate to write to info or mail@daneurope.org. Or if it's a medical question, you could write an email to medical@daneurope.org. Thank you very much.